I was reading The Sorrows of Young Werther, and I couldn't help but think that Werther was a complete simp and frickin' psycho. Of course, every work should be considered according to the period in which it was written. In a cultural context, Werther is a simp today, but yesterday he was a great romantic, which led the masses to identify with. But apart from that, Werther has an effect on the collective consciousness, which will continue to be shaped in the same way for centuries to come, as long as man remains a primitive animal. This fact made it difficult for me to read, not because it was a bad work, but because it was a brutally excellent work. A prescient artifact, a work that sheds more light on the present than the day it was published, a work that we thought that the epidemic it created on the day it was published passed with a small minority, but shaped today's society. In the first pages of the book, Werther seeks refuge in a town to escape the thoughts of Leonore, the sister of his correspondent and his former lover, and hopes to forget Leonore in this town. Far from taking responsibility for this separation, he escapes the harsh reality by saying, "I need a lullaby." Unable to overcome the Peter Pan syndrome, Werther is found unattractive by those around him and resents this, saying, "No one understands me. They are all idiots." He uses the town, which he decorates with forced happiness in his descriptions, to forget his pain and anger, but neither the charming valley of the town nor the chirping of the mayfly saves him. Lotte does. He doesn't fall in love with Lotte at first sight, he falls in love at the first opportunity. Lotte is a happy woman, optimistic towards everyone, and she is also engaged. She is not in love with Werther, and she is quite at peace with her situation. But no, Werther must have her. Lotte invites him to the ball, and they dance, and from that day on, he wears the blue frock coat for weeks. He wants to see Lotte every day, and he tells her so. Literally, every day. Everyone knows that this is not a friendly request, but a perverted one. When Lotte takes his hand, he goes mad and talks about it for lines in his letters. Somehow, he seems to realize the impossibility of this union and leaves the town. But again, he can't bear the pain and returns. This time, Lotte leaves tolerance aside and explains to him again that she is not in love with him and that she is engaged, even though Werther knows this. Werther's blaming session begins. That happy lot is probably losing it, but since we haven't seen perspective from anyone other than Werther, we don't know. Think about it. Try to imagine a little. Do I need to explain more how toxic Werther is? Nuff said. In a land besieged by Werthers, Sigmund Freud descended like a prophet. Then French Freud came onto the scene. The shit got violent. We really couldn't understand shit.
La femme est manque à être pour le homme. La femme n'est pas un objet, elle est un autre sujet. Le mot est trompeur. La femme n'existe pas. I don't know French. What the fuck is that shit?
According to Lacan, before 6-8 months of development, the baby cannot integrate the objects and individuals around him, including himself. Unable to coordinate his own body, the baby is surprised by the complete reflection when put in front of a mirror by his parents. Unlike the baby's broken and needy body, this image settles in him as an ideal ego. The ego, born out of this first identification, alienates the baby from himself with the illusion of reflection in the mirror and puts him in the imaginary order. The baby dreams of wishful thinking on this ideal and makes the artist in him vomit. The ideal baby wants to reach is impossible to reach. Even in a scenario where he will reach, what he desires will not be the same as what he achieved. Lacan interpret this unattainable desire as jouissance and its inaccessibility as objet petit a. Jouissance forces the baby to use language, and language puts him in symbolic order as a result. With symbolic order, language divides reality into parts that require signification and objective relations. The baby wants a hug and uses signifiers to get it. These signifiers canalize the jouissance need and inscribe it inside the symbolic order. The other of language stands between two as a third party, and it executes the agreement inside a protection function of fantasy rather than genuine, real connection. Baby never gets the hug he wants, nor the woman does exist. The woman does not exist in symbolic order, based on man position. Because man is a, she's non-a, she lacks the definition of universal generalization, unlike the phallus function founded upon man. Women's phallus deficiency is not in relation to any object, so it cannot be represented in unconscious or in objective relations, or by any signifiers. In the subjectivity of the one woman, all identifications come from second hand, therefore making the woman solely non-existent. The woman is not object, she's another subject that identifies a man. The woman is a symptom of man. Love is deceptive. It is deceptive because it involves giving what one does not have. This first occurs when the mother uses her baby as a substitute for her lacking symbolic phallus. However, this substitute is not enough to satisfy the mother's desire, and the desire persists even after she has had a child. Unable to satisfy his mother's desire, the child identifies either with phallus or with the phallic mother. With the father's involvement in the relationship, the child becomes castractioned and either accepts or rejects that he cannot be his mother's phallus. Werther rejects and leaves only hatred and blame for his mother, carrying his love to Charlotte in his mother figure. To manifest his unresolved Oedipal conflicts and his idealization of Charlotte as a mirror of himself that he desired to become, but at that moment the father figure Albert appears, representing the rival for the mother's affection. Failure to give what you have ends with the love of giving what you don't have. Werther gives his life, which authentically and cheeringly he doesn't have, to someone who never gets it. The subject's desire is not for the object itself, but for the object to fill the subject's sense of lack. I would argue that true love is to give up the belief of ownership in ourselves that satisfies the desire of the other person and the narcissism of the belief that the other person needs it. The answer to that is not suicide, Werther. Suicide is not a sacrifice because it does not involve any kind of giving or selflessness. In order for an act to be considered a sacrifice, it must involve giving up something of value, whether it is material possessions, time, or personal freedom. However, in suicide, the person is not giving up anything, but rather ending their own existence. Werther does not even trying to give anything to Charlotte, rather he's trying to get, because in Werther's case, there is no object of desire to be fulfilled outside of himself. As we have seen in the letters throughout the entire book, there is no one other than him that we heard a comment from. There is no one but him. He's selfish, but unselfish in a way he doesn't own himself. He's owned by himself. He is slave of his own thoughts, slave of his own mirror. Since Platon's Symposium, we have considered that love is two missing pieces waiting to complete each other. This is quite arrogant and narcissistic, and it's rely on exchange of deceptions to form a false fulfillment. Love is deceptive because when we think we feel our partner, we unilaterally feel only ourselves. When we think we are misleading someone, we are misleading ourselves. The only thing we unite with the other is the delusion of mutual belief that we are united in everything. Love cannot be complementary of two incompletenessness. You can't give someone your love. You can only nurture their understanding of love, trying to reach out to someone, to get someone. Weighing what you do for them, what they do for you on a scale, is a relationship of objectifiers, an objectified one driving by functionality, not mutual love. In mutual love, giving and receiving are experiences as a unity without any definition. Definition is a thought. A thought is a point, and if you take it alone, you are only putting a point on a point. In a linear equation, we move into the void. Linear relations are a regular line moving on a line. Non-linear relations are the cycle that moves from chaos and meets in chaos. To try to define the non-linear is to turn it into a linear equation. To fill the gap in linear relations, we take refuge in intellectually dissatisfying fallacy based on cause and effect relationships. But we are not able to maintain it without feeling that it is a fallacy. We cannot even be able to look at the thoughts and judgments in our minds independently of the outside world, let alone look at the outside world without the thoughts and judgments in our minds. We cannot be capable of reaching the unattainable desire for absolute positivity within an isolated self. We cannot be independent of chaos. Only via mass delusion can we defend illusion. Only by recognition can we defend definitions. But while we can turn the linear into a non-linear equation with the mass, we cannot turn the non-linear into a linear equation, and we only sacrifice ourselves as an illusion without gaining autonomy from chaos. Our identity in society puts ourself into an existential crisis. Every mirror we shield against chaos breaks and opens wounds in us. In the search for an isolated self, what we consider absolute becomes blinded when criticism and crisis are deactivated, loses the ability to distill the crisis, and drags us to the inevitable disaster. The ideal becomes a mass delirium, and the opium of this mass becomes recognition. I want to be king. I need your recognition, but you're not a king. Therefore, you're not in a position to fully satisfy my desire for for recognition. But if you were a king, you wouldn't be in a position to recognize me as a king, because you are the king. But because you are the king, nobody can recognize as such, because nobody is king like you. Each of us experience the confrontation as a threat to our position of uniqueness and supremacy in our identity. We are unable to acknowledge each other as creatures of the same order without abandoning our own identities, so we must fight to the death.
Presentation of itself, however, as the pure abstraction of self-consciousness consists in showing itself as the pure negation of its subjective mode, or in showing that it is not attached to any specific existence, not to the individuality common to existence as such, that it is not attached to life. This presentation is a twofold action on the part of the other, and action on its own part. Insofar as it is the action of the other, each seeks the death of the other. But in doing so, the second kind of action on its own part, is also involved, for the former involves the staking of its own life. Thus, the relation of the two self-conscious individuals is such that they prove themselves and each other through a life-and-death struggle. They must engage in this struggle, or they must raise their certainty of being for themselves the truth, both in the case of the other and in their own case. And it is only through staking one's life that freedom is won. Only thus is it proved that for self-consciousness, its essential being is not just being, not the immediate form in which it appears, not its submergence in the expanse of life, but rather that there is nothing present in it which could not be regarded as a vanishing moment, that it is only pure being for self. The individual who has not risked his life may well be recognized as a person, but he has not attained to the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. Similarly, just as each stakes his own life, so each must seek the other's death, for it values the other no more than itself. Its essential being is present to it in the form of another, it is outside of itself, and must rid itself of its self-externality. The other is an immediate consciousness entangled in a variety of relationships, and it must regard its otherness as a pure being for self, or as an absolute negation.
But what Hegel did not foresee, and what Marx triggered, was the fact that this linear fallacy would be reversed as it multiplied. Today, there is no moral order to finance the fight between good and evil, weak and strong, white and black, lords and bandsmen. Today, there is no more important task than the satisfaction of the singular individual and the recognition of the individual. And the singular individual has no other goal than to keep the dualities within itself in balance. Werther's recognition of Lotte means nothing. Lotte doesn't care about that. Both lord and bondsman are weaknesses that exist only in the individual. What Marx did not foresee was the hegemony of the individual. If Miyamoto Musashi existed today, he would be banned from society and immediately imprisoned as a notorious murderer who saw the individual as a tool for his philosophy. Napoleon would have to make a trip to a rehabilitation center if, as a young child, he put on an extravagant show with his toy soldiers. Or, at best, if he had succeeded in becoming a politician and being for self in today's world, he would be remembered not as the ruler of the world, but as the mistake of the past. In Crime and Punishment, the character Raskolnikov represented the end of the age of duality, the failure of that era. Werther, on the other hand, is the failure of the era of individualism and the representative of the end of this era regarding romantics, or to say, doomers. If we think in terms of mirror stage theory, the pure ego is not an ideal to be achieved, but the beginning of the search for an ideal, and it changes from the moment one interacts with the other. To reach the pure egoism advocated requires one to ignore the other and the symbolic order, and to remain stuck at the beginning. Werther ignores the other, but cannot stand the others ignoring him, and as a result, he continues to interfere with the symbolic order like a bitch would. Raskolnikov wants others to convince him that he is Napoleon because he finds it impossible to be his own Napoleon. Werther also finds it impossible to love himself and needs others to give him love. Unable to benefit from the ease provided by the Lord-Bondsman dialectic, these two lords are crushed under the difficulty of being an individual. But Werther rebels against this difficulty while Raskolnikov welcomes it. Werther puts his own ego at the forefront in the era of individualism, and his romanticism is toxic to us individualists. Werther turns the war of all against all into everyone's war with his ego. His ego, which he puts above himself and for which he sacrifices his life, has become an example of making a martyr of oneself. Among egoists, echo chamber, in an extremely radical and sterner would have objected, dependent way, and thus represents this epoch. Although we are unlikely to be caught up in the egoist era, we are quite close. Our day is dominated by mirrors. The internet is more of a mirror industry than anything else. All these mirrors expect you to sacrifice everything else to keep the ego supreme. You'll be neither lord nor bondsman. You'll be the voice. Social media gives everyone a voice. Every single ego is a voice. Telling how to do it pays more than actually doing it. Criticize to polarize. Reject modernity and embrace suffering from your comfortable seat. Benefit from technology, thanks you modernity, and give your voice. Fake it till they believe it. What you do and what you say don't match, as it doesn't have to be. We as babies put in front of a mirror can't even find time to get up or even improve from these mirror. We're too crammed with speed and consumption. Just when we are going to keep up with one mirror and go by it, just then the second mirror pops up and our ideal changes. Then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. What's the trend of the day? We are babies who can't get up from the mirror. Inactives on the way to becoming info beasts. This is certainly not a new concern. We have been babies put in front of mirrors since the Stone Age, but with each progress, it got worse. Despite all the progress given to the external material values, this civilization game we created didn't change our instincts. Rather, it masked it with a herd of concepts. But as the world becomes more complex in every change, the simplicity of our desires becomes more painful. Since this burden is hard to embrace, many try to compensate with echo chamber values. They see their escape point as embrace. They embrace ideologies to maintain the status quo, so that this set of certainty and stability does not cast doubt on the ego they cast in their wishful thinking. This is the tragedy of Werther. Today, many masses, despite being corrupted by consumerism and information overload, are still living in the initial stage without achieving anything, and they will most likely perish with this delusion. Seeing death as an arrival like Werther, the only conclusion in which death can be considered arrival would be comically betraying oneself for the sake of pre-default, the self that is a mirror. Werther's absence from external authorities, yet his addicted desire, and the life he spent for external values is sad. But the fact that it's a common rebellion fallacy we're very familiar with, horrific. It can only be a rebellion in terms of the rejection of one's suicide by all external authorities, which is not a rebellion of the person. The person is no longer in question. Werther wants external values to be shaped by centering an ideal that is shaped by external authorities in a way he rejects to comprehend, and he positions his life on this axis. Very comfy, irresponsible, saddening suicide. It never mattered for Werther. I have no need of anything. I need a lullaby.